Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for all coming in to hear me speak tonight. I'm very much looking forward to sharing an opportunity to discuss one of my favourite things, Russian Revolution. Brilliant. Can you hear me clearly at the back? Yeah, great. Okay. So, when I started my studies of revolutionary Russia, I gave a preliminary presentation at a conference on Russian Revolution, and I was taken aside by one of the senior scholars there, and he said, "My dear, are you sure about this regional business?" He said, "You know, when the bell tolls in Moscow, the bell tolls all over Russia." And that, I think, is a very succinct summary of the old school historiography on the Russian Revolution. And that is the idea that the events in the metropole, that is in Petrograd primarily, but also in Moscow, define the shape of the Russian Revolution. And so this was, I would say, a pre-existing, quite strongly held idea that was reinforced in the historiography of this very rich historiography of the revolutionary period. I ignored him and decided that I wanted to find out what happened in, well, for my PhD I looked at the province of Nizhegorодskaya, or Nizhny Novgorod province in central Russia. And then for work in my postdoctoral period, I looked at Kazan as well. And for the book that I wrote in, which was published in 2007, I actually tried to draw comparisons and comparatives between Nizhegorодskaya and Kazanskaya provinces during 1917. I'm particularly interested in ordinary people's experiences of 1917. Now, I was taken to task by a friend and a great scholar, a chap called Yanni Katsonis, in a review of my book a few years ago, and he said, "So Badcock's book, very well researched, very interesting, lots of great insights." He says, "Ordinary people, who is she talking about when she talks about ordinary people?" And it is a very good question. He said, "Sarah is trying to define ordinary people by who they are not. They are not elites. They are not in the centre. They are not powerful." Well, but in practice, and the more I thought about this, the more I realised that he was right, and that we need to challenge our conception of what do we mean by ordinary people. And we do know that it means something, don't we? We could use the term the lower classes, but that can be used as a pejorative, and it's another awkward, baggy term. So I will continue to struggle with that, but I will refer to ordinary people today. But I acknowledge that there is a challenge in trying to understand and define who we mean when we talk about the non-elites, if you like, in Russian political life. So, I'll just start by introducing regional studies. So what I'm going to ask you today is well, what do regional studies add? I spent all these years in the archives looking at my particular provinces, beavering away to try and find out what happens in Nizhegorодskaya and Kazanskaya provinces in 1917. And then the next question though was, well, does that change the big picture? We already have a pre-existing narrative of what happens in 1917. So does my regional perspective bring anything new? And I will argue that it does. I think that I'm not trying to suggest that central histories are not important, because they are, and the metropoles are important. The metropoles are also regions, they are also spaces where revolution happens, and they are as relevant as any other space within the Russian Empire. But we need to remember that the Russian territory is not a little neat nation state. It is a massive sprawling empire that covered 1/6 of the world's surface area. So what happens in the Russian Empire is not a neat, easily containable, easily manageable event. It is an extremely particularly if we're looking at social histories, we're looking at a multiplicity of experience and alternative. So I will argue then that, one, it is important because it gives us, doing regional studies gives us a sense of some of the richness and diversity of the population's responses and experiences within 1917. But secondly, I would say that it enhances our understandings about power, political power, and participation. And political power is something which is generally being discussed in relation to the centre, but that I will argue today that actually by looking at the peripheries, we can see how the potential of power was actually constrained, managed and limited by local experience. So if we imagine the kind of the classic model, particularly actually in right-wing historiography, a classic model would be of Lenin, the evil dictator, the puppet master in the centre of the web, manipulating the people. And I would flip that absolutely. I would invert it completely, because I would suggest that in fact political elites, including Lenin, had their alternatives, their options, determined to them by the responses of Russia's population. So this is the kind of major argument, I suppose, that I'm going to make today. I'd like to add, this is especially for this audience, that I think that class is a blunt tool of analysis if we're going to talk about Russia in 1917, and that social identities are complex, multifaceted things, and that class is one way of trying to understand who people were, who people defined themselves as, and that I would argue that we need to incorporate a very diverse array of different possible understandings of identity if we are to gain a deeper understanding of how people behave and how people interact in 1917. And a final point then for my introductory comments, if you like, is that I'm going to argue that by looking at regions we can find out a little more about the rural population. So for many years in the historiography, the rural population, often talked about as peasants, are the dark masses. There are more than 80% of the Russian population in 1917 are categorised by a state as peasant, and that is that they make their living from working land. Who are these people? We talk about peasants as if we know who they are. Are they intensive agriculturists in central Black Earth Russia? Are they beekeepers in Vyatka? Are they foresters in the forested regions? Are they itinerant workers, as very many rural people had strong relationships with urban space? And I think that by actually exploring what goes on in particular locales, we actually find out that these categories that we use quite casually, like a peasant, are not at all useful in understanding who those individuals really were, and what commonalities they might have had. And I understand, and my students despair of me, I think, that my approach is it's classically a splitter approach. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at this massive, complex, diverse picture and saying we need to split it. We need to look at these specific individual facets in order to try and understand the whole better. Some scholars are lumpers. They like to look at big pictures and overall arches, and that's also good. I'm not arguing that my way is the only way, but rather I am arguing that there needs to be a multiple approaches to the scholarship in order to penetrate social histories, in order to understand everyday lives. So that's my introduction. So I'll talk. I haven't done slides because I think people get fed up with PowerPoint. I get a bit fed up with PowerPoint. And I thought maybe you just listen to me. It's not a very long talk, it's only half an hour, but just to try and keep you where I am. So I've done a little introduction. I'm going to talk about three key things. I'm going to talk about the structures of power and powerlessness in 1917. Then I'm going to talk about people on the margins and what sort of people were on the margins of power in 1917 and how their voices might be heard. And then I'm going to illustrate some of the points that I've made by looking in particular at the food crisis in 1917. So those are the three key areas that I'm going to discuss, and each of those areas I hope will feed into a more general understanding about who were ordinary people and how did they relate to the Russian Revolution. So if we start with structures of power then, so for those of you who are familiar with some of the scholarship on the Russian Revolution, structures of power usually start with the notion of dual power. And this is the idea that in 1917 there were two main seats of power, and that one of them was seated around the provisional government, a so-called bourgeois power, and the other was seated around particularly the Petrograd Soviet, but by association other Soviets, and that was a socialist or a popular power, and that these two seats of power are in conflict with one another, and that ultimately, by October 1917, we have the triumph of socialist, of Soviet power. And so that is a kind of a traditional model, right, of what power looks like. Well, I mean, I'm not going to talk about it at length today. You can ask me if you want me to talk about it. I don't think that dual power adequately describes the relationship in the centre. I think that the relationship between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet is much more complex than dual power allows. However, if I want to talk about regions, I can say confidently that dual power is not an adequate description for how political power operates in regional centres. Because although we do get provisional committees, is what they're called, which is the provisional government authorised sort of organs of power within the regions, and alongside those we get Soviets, usually started as workers' Soviets and often becoming Soviets of workers and soldiers, and usually alongside them, usually separately, Soviets of peasants' deputies as well. So although we do get Soviets and provisional government bodies in regional centres, these two kind of bodies of power do not work separately, and they do not work antagonistically. Rather, they work often, they're very much in relation to local personnel, who's around, and they tend to work very closely together. It varies from place to place because power is dependent on locality. It depends on what's going on in your region, who your people are, what happens at what moment. So in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, they have an extraordinary, one of my colleagues wrote a PhD on this, it's brilliant, but he shows us that the Soviet in Krasnoyarsk is everywhere, it's powerful, it's well in control of the situation, much earlier in 1917 than October. In other places, you have a much more close relationship between Soviet and provisional government bodies, and that is because these men, and they were almost exclusively men, on the ground, trying to run power, trying to make the province governed, these men had everything in common. They were all trying to work towards the same basic aims, and that was they sought to administer the region securely, to deal with the food supply crisis, to avert any anarchic situations. They all sought that, the provisional government and the Soviet-related organisations, and they worked together to try to resolve problems. So on a meta level, if you like, on a big level, I would say that dual power doesn't work. And we can see this by looking at a range of specific examples, which I don't think are that interesting. But if we want to break it down a bit more, I think that what the locales, the study of the regions, show us, it's less about power and more about powerlessness. Because actually, what we find is that central power in 1917, and when I say central power, I do not just mean the provisional government, I mean the provisional government and the Soviet. The Soviet has absolutely no authority in 1917, and neither does the provisional government. What I mean by that is that they are unable to make either regional governments and much less local populations respond to their requests, their demands, their orders, because there is no direct chain of command and of control. There is no ultimate threat of violence, actually. I mean, how does power operate? How do we control a population? The reality is that the provisional government and the Soviet relied upon imprecation, request, appeal. And for those of you who've studied and taught this, you'd be very familiar with the very wide range of appeals that emerged in 1917. That was all that these bodies had. So they had to appeal to the population to, for example, stay calm, to not seize land, to give their grain to the grain committees, all these kinds of things. They didn't have a hard line to revert to. They had to actually rely on this kind of almost like a moral relationship between the population and the government. And early in 1917 there was a really strong, and I think a rather touching belief in the kind of true, pure relationship that would emerge between the population and the government. And the provisional government was so completely committed to this idea, they introduced democratisation. And democratisation was the process by which local government and local authority was devolved to local committees. Everything was committeefied. So there were committees for food, committees for land, There were committees for beekeeping, committees for every imaginable activity that would be covered at a local level. And the provisional government believed that these committees would free the power of ordinary people, that it would enable them to engage meaningfully with the state and would enable the state to meet its own demands, right? But we have a really profound problem for the provisional government and for the Soviet in 1917, and that was that democratisation could not operate as a chain of command. So I will give you an example, and my example will come from land use. And I'm sure, again, you'll probably be familiar with the trope of peasant seizure of land in 1917. And it's certainly the case that rural people all over Russia transgress the norms of private property in a whole range of different ways. And the ways in which they will do that will depend on what kind of region they live in. It might be that they go chopping wood if it's a very heavily wooded area. It might be that they seize arable land. There's a whole range of different things they do. But land use is one of the big contestations of 1917. So the provisional government's line, and it is a reasonable line, and it is fully supported by the Petrograd Soviet, is that a final solution on the land question has to wait until Russia has a fairly fully elected assembly who can make those decisions. The provisional government, as a provisional body, cannot make final decisions about land use. So they ask the population to not seize land, to not make autonomous actions. They plead with them, they ask them as decent citizens, and they enforce this through land committees, so that local communities from at the bigger level, at the province, going down to the county, and then down to the district, and then down to the little villages, they're all expected to elect committees. And these committees, these land committees, will decide then how they will manage the land situation until the government is in a situation to be able to make a full, fair, free resolution. That's a great idea. However, what happens is that the locally elected committees hear the cry, and this is an archival reference which I like very much. I actually started one of my chapters of my book with it. They said, "We elected you, you must listen to us." So here we have the break in the chain of command, right? This is where democratisation fails the centre, because democratisation demands that the electees, the people who chose their representatives on that committee, that they would be heard. So in fact, the local committees respond to the needs of their local constituents, which are in absolute direct violation of central policy, right? So we have a break. And I will give you an example of that break. There are lots and lots of examples, but I'll give you a nice one. So the Kazan Land Committee, so this is the regional land committee, this is quite a high-level committee, not one of the little poxy ones down at village level. The Kazan Land Committee in May 1917 issued a decree whereby all privately held land would be automatically transferred into the hands of the land committees, who would decide on the use of that land. And it was meant to be a holding measure, and it said, as of now, all privately held land belongs to the land committees for now, because they will know how to use this land most effectively, how to maximise our tillage, right? And they just did it. The provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet spitting feathers. You cannot do that. You must rescind that order. No. And even if they had rescinded it, it wouldn't have made any difference at all, because local communities all around Kazan said, brilliant, check out our land committee. They made some good decisions. They took hold of this situation. Now, if you were to read, and you know, when we talk about stats, statistics are really slippery things. If we see the stats on disorder in Kazan region is one of the most disordered land regions, right? But if you read the reports in the Kazan Land Committee and in the local newspapers there, what they say is that they have one of the most orderly, best controlled, least anarchic regions, because there isn't any anarchic seizure, because actually the land committees are managing and regulating the control of land, which is entirely believable. The landowners are writing hell and fire to the central organisations, complaining bitterly about the actions of their land committee. But what I'm trying to show you is that democratisation and the diffusion of political power particularly in a period of profound economic, social and political stress, is going to be very, very difficult to manage. And this story, this break from centre to periphery in terms of political power, that is actually, in some senses, that is the story both of 1917 and of the Russian Civil War, sort of 17 to 21. One scholar of the Civil War made quite a forceful argument that on a basic level, the fights of the Civil War were actually about control of resources, and that rather than seeing it as a single conflict, that you see it as multiple minor conflicts over control of resources, over attempts from the state to get back hold of the peripheries, because this break between centre and periphery is very profound. So that's the example I gave is land, but I could have given others. So I've talked a bit then about regional power structures. I'm going to go down a bit now. We've established that democratisation diffuses power, but this diffusion of power is imperfect and it is incomplete. So although we have this astounding redistribution of political power through the democratisation process, that does not mean that ordinary people in the Russian provinces all have an equivalent access to power, because power was concentrated in certain hands. It was concentrated in urban hands. People who lived in urban spaces were disproportionately likely to have access to direct political power. It was disproportionately male, and it was disproportionately ethnically Russian. So to give you an example of why that was, I mean, Kazan, which is one of the regions which I studied, has a substantial non-Russian population, quite a diverse non-Russian population. Vyatka, which is adjacent to my provinces, also has a substantial non-Russian population. So Vyatka, I've got the stat here so I don't forget, 23% of Vyatka is non-Russian. So they're Udmurt, Mari, and I've forgotten the other one. Some Tatars, not many in Vyatka, but 23% non-Russian. But of the urban population is 0.01% non-Russian. Because in urban spaces, those urban spaces are dominated by ethnic Russians. And it is in rural spaces that you will have patches of very heavy non-Russian community presence, right? So when you think that power is centred around either regional towns or district towns, but non-Russian communities won't be in towns, that means that they are less likely to get immediate access to the formal sort of bounds of political power. Not only that, but there are going to be linguistic and cultural boundaries as well. One of my favourite anecdotes, which I'm sure if you've heard me tell it before, apologies. One of the big jobs that the provisional government had to do in 1917, one of the many big jobs it had to do in 1917, was it had to have a full census of the population, because they wanted to have full, fair, free elections, the first full, fair, free elections ever for Russia, including female suffrage, right, which had not been a thing. They had to try and count the population. So they actually had to go. They had no idea how many people lived where. There hadn't been a full census in years. So they needed to send statisticians to locales to try and give an assessment of how many people lived where. And there's this lovely account of a statistician turning up at a Tatar village in a region called Kozmodemyansk, which is in Kazan. And he'd come just to find out the census. People are really, really suspicious about census taking. They don't like telling you how many people. They definitely don't like telling you how much stuff you've got, because they are suspicious, rightly suspicious of the state. And this very deep suspicion of what the state will get from you if you are to give them information is something which is particularly profound often in non-Russian speaking communities. This particular Tatar village, the statistician walked into the street and he said, there was complete silence. I looked around, the doors were open, the houses were empty, there was nobody. A chicken walked across the street. He said, they'd run, they fled, they ran and they hid in the woodland. I couldn't count the population. I didn't know where they were. This is a very real problem. It's something that the late imperial state also was subject to. It didn't know its population. And these sort of fundamental, this is how power operates. This is how states are strong. States need to know their populations if they are to control them, even if they are to administer them effectively. The late imperial state didn't know its population. The 1917 state sure as hell didn't know their population. And if you add to the mix of kind of demographic uncertainties, 14 million men mobilised by 1917, that's a lot of bodies on the move, isn't it? And then you add to that refugees, removed factories. You know, you've got this massive population movement in this period. Very difficult actually to establish who lives where. And power and knowledge are two things which are very close together. I'm diverging, I'm digressing slightly, because I wanted to talk about my people on the margins. So I talked a little bit about those non-Russians and why they might be marginalised in power structures, and also how they might respond, right? But that running away, that silence, that is a resistance. It's a resistance to the state. It is a refusal to cooperate. It means that the state is unable to engage with that population. When it comes to grain, which is what I'm going to talk about last, it means that the state is unable to enact its own policies. I'm going to look, though, very briefly, because I am running a bit tight, on a particular group who's often extremely marginalised politically and has been marginalised very heavily in the historiography, and that's women. We very, very rarely hear about women in 1917. We hear about them even less in political fora. Women are really systematically marginalised in formal political structures in 1917. They do not turn up on factory committees. They do not turn up on rural councils. They are very rarely present on national voting lists and those kinds of things. But they make up very small numbers of the candidates for town assemblies and national assemblies. And I'm not going to talk about today why that is, although I can if you ask me. But what I wanted to do is just point to a particular group that transcends class. It gives me a nice example of why class doesn't always work as a social category, and that is soldatki. Soldatki was the word used to describe soldiers' wives. So I've already mentioned that we had 14 million soldiers called up by 1917, and by 1917 some 7 million of those men had either been killed or wounded or taken prisoner. This enormous, colossal, horrific human suffering and loss which is connected to the First World War, which is one of the big drivers of experience in 1917, which again I don't really have time to dwell on today, but I could. So soldiers' wives are generally speaking going to be marginalised. They don't have access to formal political power because they don't sit on the committees, they're not part of the Soviet, they don't have formal representation, and yet, I mean, they turn up actually during the First World War, but they really get into their stride in 1917. And what we have is regional, not national. There really isn't a national soldiers' wives organisation that I'm aware of, but regionally we get very strong associations of soldiers' wives. These women who are denied formal political representation make a noise and they make a fuss and they demonstrate and they make their voices heard. So you have in Kazan, in Nizhny, in Tambov, in parts of Ukraine, there are a whole range of examples I could give you, but I'll stick to my Kazan and Soldatki because they are the most fun. Soldatki union in Kazan was especially vigorous. I think there were probably some officers' wives involved in the organisation. Just from the photographs of these women, they looked quite well dressed. But they got them together, they protested and sent letters and complaints to the local Soviet, which were ignored. So they demanded that their followers come, meet in Kazan Centre, meet at the Kremlin, march to the Soviet officers, march to the Provisional Government's organisational officers, and kick up fuss. They made a lot of noise. They shouted outside, a very large group of women. They marched right through the centre of the city with placards, abusing the men in power, abusing them, denigrating them, cursing them, and then they stood outside the building, which had closed and indeed locked doors. I think that the men were a little concerned about the potential for violence that can emerge from these situations, and they barracked them. So what are they asking for? Why are they complaining? Well, they've been given access in 1914 to a soldier's wife's allowance, which is a new thing, which nearly bankrupted the Tsarist state. the Tsarist state, in its munificence, decided to provide soldiers' wives or their mothers with an allowance to recompense them for their loss. This was turned out to be a very expensive thing to do. But in 1917, when you've got a situation of massive inflation, money is losing its value, those allowances suddenly don't mean very much. What we find is that soldiers' wives, these often lower class, often illiterate women, know how to speak the language of the state. So they invoke the language of the revolution, and they invoke the language of authority and power. And they say, these are our revolutionary rights. We have given our sons, we have given our husbands to this fight, to this state. This state needs to give us our dues. We need our allowance, it needs to be tripled. We need prisoners of war to help us sow our fields. And we need a fuel. It's often the three things they tend to complain about. They make such a fuss. If you read the newspaper reports in the next week, it is all over the newspapers, is the Soldatki. And the Soviet is cringing about the prospect of letting down lower class women who are vocal and making a fuss. So these women are on the margins of formal political power, and yet they do have power and they operate it. They operate it in a regional context. So I'm not arguing that they are deciding Lenin's future, but they are deciding their own futures, and they are having an impact on their regional power structures. So I think it's a nice example of the ways in which political power can operate locally, which is that it can transcend the expectations that we have based on formal political power. Yeah, good. Right. So I'm going to, my final section is going to be to look at a particular problem for 1917 and interrogate it a little bit, to try and use it to really explore these questions that I've been trying to develop today about power and powerlessness. And I'm going to look at the food crisis. And the food crisis is something which has been very well covered. We know that the challenge of food distribution was one of the contributing factors to the fall of the Tsarist autocracy in February of 1917. We know that it was the issue that most bedeviled the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet right through 1917. And then it became, I would argue, the defining factor of the Civil War as well, as the contestation for food and provisions was really tensely held. So we've explored it then. There's been a couple of very good books that have explored that in a national context. What can the local and the regional context add to our understanding? Well, it helps us see, first, it helps us see the dominance of localism and economic interests among local populations, and how important those local economic interests become in a national context. So this is an issue where you really do have individual, local, rural people having an impact on the national outcomes. It really emphasises the failure of the central state to define the discourse. The central state, and when I say central state, I actually mean provisional government and Soviet, seek to engage the rural population in a discourse whereby they will sacrifice for the state. We already have soldiers sacrificing everything for the state, and now they're going to ask the rural population to sacrifice profits, goods, for the state good, for the better of the nation, right? And that fails. And then finally, we see an avenue for the potential for power, both at local, at immediate, and from the margins. So those marginalised non-Russian communities, man, they can make some noise when it comes to food distribution. And I'll give you some examples. So my provinces, I didn't know this when I started, but they turned out to be very good ones for talking about food crisis, because Nizhegorod and Kazan, which neighbour one another, Kazan is a grain producing region, that is, it is a grain exporting region, so it produces a lot more grain than it needs to eat, and so it's one of the big exporters. It's not the biggest, the Don and some of the other central agricultural regions are bigger, but it's an important food exporting province. Nizhny Novgorod does have some export areas, but mostly it is an importing province. It eats more than it grows. So you've got these two provinces alongside one another. I'm not going to complicate it further by telling you that actually within the provinces you have districts which eat and districts which sell. And this is because locality is complex. And when I talk about these are regions that are the size of Belgium. You know what I mean? They are like a country in another context. But anyway, so we've got our two regions adjacent to one another. The provisional government in March 1917 issued a grain monopoly, and they said all grain is owned by the state. We will set a fixed price for the purchase of grain, and you will sell your grain to us at a fixed price, and you can't privately sell grain. That would undermine this grain monopoly. And it fails absolutely. So in Nizhny Novgorod and Kazan, we get walkers and movers. Thousands and thousands of people are authorised by their local communities in Nizhny province to walk across, to get across to Kazan and to try to buy grain from other local communities because they are hungry or because they fear hunger. And so they utilise their rational human economic instincts to go buy stuff, and they're quite happy to pay far more than these set prices on grain because they need to secure those resources, and the local peasants are happy to sell it to them too. The regional state tries to protect, prevent and control this, and they are unable to do so. They cannot control this. So you've got illicit uncontrolled trade. Then you've got the food committees. Now I've already talked about democratisation and what that actually means, and that democratisation means that those who elected demand direct responsibility from their committees. When it comes to food committees, that means that if you are in an exporting region, you refuse to sell at fixed prices. And if you are in an importing region, you demand that your food committee gets you the grain that you need. And if they don't, then they're probably corrupt. Get rid of them and elect new ones. Because we need to be fed and our food committee needs to feed us. So we get this localism and economic interest, which is heightened by a fear of hunger. I would say that the most frequent instances of violence that you see in the local press, particularly in relation to local government, are violence towards food committees in food-hungry regions. The communities don't trust their food committees if their food committees aren't able to resource them. So the provisional government, with its fixed prices, how does it manage this? It is absolutely unable to. It tries, appeals, imprecations, requests, requirements, and they have absolutely no impact. There is a very strongly held belief that people need to be educated. If we could just tell people they don't understand the revolution, they don't understand this state, if we explain to them what is required, then they will behave. But this was a profound misunderstanding on the part of both the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. I think the political elites across the political spectrum had this misconception that actually we just need to tell people they're very foolish, we'll explain it to them and then they'll sort it out. Absolutely not. I mean, the Bolsheviks seized control of the food committee in Kazan before October 25th, 1917, and they were really confident that what they needed to do was go out there and talk to rural communities to sort this out. They said, oh, it's this provisional government nonsense, we'll talk to these local communities and they will release their grain to us. Well, they hell. So those non-Russian communities, I'm not picking them out as an only, but as an example, you know, like the Tatars in Kosmodemyansk, they don't just refuse the census, they also refuse fixed prices. They definitely refuse any instance of possible seizure of grain. So by the end of summer 1917, the provisional government is starting to threaten forced action to secure grain from the rural regions. They don't actually have the resources, they don't have the loyal soldiers to be able to do that. But that's the situation we've got to by the end of summer 1917. The Tatars, those dispossessed, those marginalised voices in summer 1917, they barricade their village and they say, let them come. And they say, we'll have our deserter soldiers, we'll bring them in. And they don't do it, they don't have any clout, these local communities, to actually seize grain from peasants who don't want to release it. So I suppose the reason I'm using this example is because it's a very good one for showing how local communities can have an impact on national policy. So, yeah. And the calls for education are subsumed through 1917 into calls for force. So I'm going to make a couple of very brief concluding comments. And my first is that study of the regions doesn't give us any silver bullets. It doesn't answer our big questions. You know, was October a popular rising or was it a coup? You know, all these big questions. There aren't any simple answers to those questions. And the quest for ordinary people, as I implied at the outset, is slippery and uncertain. Who is it we are talking about? But the thing that's wonderful about studying any aspect of the Russian Revolution, but for me actually particularly exciting about regional revolutions, is that by unpicking little places and spaces, we're finding this rich diversity of national, ethnic, gendered, cultural difference in the ways in which revolution is understood and experienced, and that enriches our social understandings of this period. And then finally, I'll just reiterate that point that I made at the outset. Far from the political elites being the puppet masters, calling the dance to the marionettes of the masses, I would argue, on the contrary, that the political elites have their political alternatives determined for them by the actions of local people in local communities across Russia. So that's it.